On the afternoon of July 23, 1944, Captain Charles Sweeney sat in the cockpit of a C-47 transport aircraft 35 miles southwest of Myitkyina, Burma, staring at fuel gauges that read empty. Behind him in the cargo bay sat 42 wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical evacuation. Around him in the sky circled 49 other C-47 seconds, all carrying wounded men, all running on fumes, all watching to see what Sweeney would do. The nearest airfield capable of handling mass casualties was Henderson Field, 58 miles away across mountainous jungle terrain. His engines should have quit 5 minutes ago. Sweeney was 28 years old, from Worcester, Massachusetts. He'd learned to fly in 1937 at a small airport outside Boston, paying for lessons by working as a mechanic. Flying had been expensive back then, $10 an hour for instruction, and Sweeney had needed every hour he could afford. He'd worked nights at a textile mill, saved his money, and showed up at the airport every Saturday morning until he'd accumulated enough hours for his commercial license. When the war started, he'd enlisted in the Army Air Forces, completed military pilot training at Randolph Field in Texas, and been assigned to transport duty. By July 1944, he'd been flying cargo and personnel in the China-Burma-India theater for 14 months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Transport pilots in the CBI theater flew the most dangerous missions in the Army Air Forces. They flew without fighter escort over terrain that killed crews even when the Japanese didn't. They flew the hump, the route over the Himalayas from India into China, where winds could flip a C-47 upside down and altitudes exceeded the aircraft's service ceiling. They flew into improvised airstrips hacked out of jungle hillsides, landing on muddy runways barely long enough for a loaded transport. They flew medical evacuation missions into forward combat zones, landing under fire to pick up wounded soldiers who would die without immediate treatment. The C-47 Skytrain was the military version of the Douglas DC-3, the aircraft that had revolutionized commercial aviation in the 1930s. It could carry 28 fully equipped paratroopers, or 6,000 pounds of cargo, or 24 stretcher cases with 3 medical attendants. Twin Pratt & Whitney engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Cruise speed 160 miles per hour. Maximum range 1,600 miles with standard fuel load. Wingspan 95 feet. Length 64 feet. It was reliable, tough, and could operate from primitive airfields. The Army Air Forces had ordered more than 10,000 of them. But on July 23, 1944, 50 C-47 seconds were about to demonstrate that even the most reliable aircraft had limits. The mission had started wrong from the beginning. The Troop Carrier Command's 1st Air Commando Group had been ordered to evacuate wounded soldiers from a forward airstrip near Myitkyina. The strip had been carved out of jungle by combat engineers, a ribbon of dirt 1,500 feet long with trees at both ends. Japanese forces controlled territory on 3 sides. The only way in or out was by air. Myitkyina was critical to Allied operations in northern Burma. The town sat at the southern end of the hump route, the only supply line keeping Chinese forces in the war against Japan. If the Japanese held Myitkyina, they could intercept transports flying the hump and strangle China. American and Chinese forces had been fighting to capture the town since May 1944. The battle had turned into a brutal siege. Casualties were mounting daily. Wounded soldiers needed evacuation to hospitals in India, but the forward airstrip could only handle 1 aircraft at a time. Captain Sweeney was flight leader for the mission. He would land first, establish the pattern, and set the pace for the other 49 aircraft. His co-pilot was First Lieutenant James Morrison, a 24-year-old from Portland, Oregon. Morrison had been flying transports in the theater for 8 months. The crew chief was Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 32-year-old aircraft mechanic from Detroit who'd been keeping C-47 seconds flying despite chronic parts shortages. The medical officer was Captain David Chen, an Army surgeon from San Francisco who would oversee loading the wounded. The forward airstrip appeared through broken clouds at 10 to 100 hours. Sweeney could see the dirt runway, the aid station tents, the rows of stretchers with wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation. He could also see smoke from recent mortar impacts and the burned wreckage of a transport that had crashed on takeoff 2 days earlier. The wreckage had been pushed to the side of the runway but served as a grim reminder of what happened when things went wrong. The soft runway surface created more drag than expected. The C-47 accelerated slowly. Trees loomed at the far end of the runway. Sweeney held the aircraft on the ground until the last possible moment, building airspeed, then pulled back on the yoke. The transport lifted off with less than 50 feet of runway remaining. The propellers clipped branches as they climbed away. Morrison exhaled slowly. That had been close. Behind them, the second C-47 was landing. The pattern was established. One aircraft landing, one loading, one departing, every 6 minutes. 50 aircraft would cycle through in 5 hours. The wounded would be in hospitals in India by evening. That was the plan. The plan lasted 90 minutes. By 11:30 hours, 20 aircraft had cycled through the strip. The remaining 30 were circling overhead, waiting their turn to land. Sweeney had completed his evacuation run and was flying back toward India with his load of wounded when his radio crackled. The voice belonged to Major William Thompson, the air operations officer coordinating the evacuation from the ground. All aircraft, abort mission. Repeat, abort mission. Strip is under heavy mortar fire, multiple casualties. Do not attempt landing. Sweeney keyed his microphone. What about the aircraft still waiting to land? Send them home. We'll try again tomorrow. Negative on sending them home, Sweeney transmitted. We're landing all aircraft today. There was a long pause. Then Thompson's voice came back, careful, measured. Charlie, the strip is closed. I've got wounded ground crew and 3 dead. The Japanese have the strip zeroed in. You can't land 30 aircraft under mortar fire. We're not landing at your strip. Then where? Henderson Field. Another pause. Henderson Field is 58 miles from here. You'll never make it. You're already running on reserve fuel. We'll make it. Sweeney switched frequencies and transmitted to the 30 C-47 seconds circling overhead. All aircraft, this is lead. Form up on me. We're proceeding to Henderson Field for mass landing. Morrison was studying his fuel gauges. Captain, we've got maybe 45 minutes of fuel. Henderson Field is 42 minutes away. That's cutting it incredibly thin. I know. If we hit headwinds or have to divert, we won't make it. I know. The other aircraft are in worse shape than we are. Some of them have been circling longer. They're probably down to 30 minutes of fuel. I know. Morrison didn't say anything else. He understood what Sweeney was doing. If they turned back to India, they'd abandon hundreds of wounded soldiers who desperately needed evacuation. If they tried Henderson Field, they might run out of fuel and crash in the jungle, killing everyone aboard. Neither option was good, but Sweeney had made his choice. The formation of 30 C-47 seconds turned northwest and headed toward Henderson Field. They climbed to 6,000 feet to clear the ridges. At that altitude, the engines burned slightly less fuel. Every gallon mattered. Sweeney calculated times and distances in his head. Henderson Field was 58 miles away. At 160 miles per hour cruise speed, that was 21.7 minutes. Add time for descent and landing pattern, call it 30 minutes total. His fuel gauges showed 38 minutes remaining. Margin of error, 8 minutes. Morrison was calculating the same numbers. If we run out of fuel 5 minutes short, we'll crash in jungle with no survivors. If we make it to Henderson Field with 5 minutes of fuel remaining, we'll have to land immediately. No time for proper pattern or approach. We'll do a straight-in approach. No pattern, no holding. Every aircraft lands immediately upon arrival. 30 aircraft doing straight-in approaches to a single runway? That's insane. You have a better idea? Morrison didn't. Sweeney transmitted to the formation. Listen carefully. We're doing straight-in approaches to Henderson Field. No landing pattern, no holding. When you arrive over the field, you land immediately. First aircraft to arrive gets the runway. Everyone else falls in behind. Spacing will be tight. Keep your eyes open and don't run into the aircraft ahead of you. One of the pilots transmitted back. Charlie, I've got maybe 25 minutes of fuel showing. I'll never make Henderson Field. Reduce power. Lean your mixture. Do whatever you need to do to stretch your fuel. I'm already at minimum power. If I reduce any further, I'll stall. Then maintain current power and hope your fuel gauges are reading conservatively. Sweeney reduced his own power settings to minimum cruise. The airspeed dropped to 140 miles per hour. At that speed, the engines burned less fuel, but the trip took longer. It was a trade-off. Less fuel consumption per minute, but more minutes of flight time. He calculated the numbers. At 140 miles per hour, Henderson Field was now 24.9 minutes away. Add time for descent and approach, call it 33 minutes total. His fuel gauges now showed 33 minutes remaining. Margin of error, 0. The formation continued northwest. Below them, the jungle stretched unbroken to the horizon. Green canopy, mountain ridges, rivers cutting through valleys. No roads, no villages, no clearings. If an aircraft went down, rescue would be impossible. Search parties would never find wreckage in that terrain. The crew would be listed as missing in action. Families back home would receive telegrams saying their sons or husbands had been lost in action over Burma. Fate unknown. Sweeney checked his watch. 15 minutes had passed since they'd turned toward Henderson Field. Fuel gauges showed 18 minutes remaining. The math was getting worse. At 10:20 hours, the first engine quit. The transmission came from Lieutenant George Patterson, flying C-47 number 43. Lead, this is 4-3. My left engine just quit. Fuel starvation. I'm feathering the prop and continuing on single engine. Sweeney transmitted back. Can you maintain altitude on single engine? Barely. I'm at 6,000 feet now, losing about 50 feet per minute. I'll be down to 4,000 by the time I reach Henderson. Stay with the formation. We're 12 minutes out. A C-47 could fly on a single engine, but performance was significantly reduced. Maximum speed dropped to 110 miles per hour. Rate of climb became negative. The aircraft would slowly descend until it either landed or crashed. Patterson had 12 minutes to reach Henderson Field before his altitude ran out. If he arrived at Henderson Field with sufficient altitude remaining, he could glide to a landing. If his altitude ran out first, he'd crash in the jungle. Sweeney's own fuel gauges showed 8 minutes remaining. Henderson Field was 9 minutes away. The math said his engines would quit before arrival. He reduced power even further, dropping airspeed to 120 miles per hour. The C-47 was barely maintaining altitude. Any further power reduction would cause the aircraft to descend. Morrison was watching the fuel gauges. 7 minutes of fuel. 8 minutes to Henderson. I can see that. We're not going to make it. We'll make it. The math says we won't. The math is wrong. Morrison looked at him. Sweeney's face was calm, focused, showing no sign of stress. He'd made his decision. They were going to Henderson Field. The fuel gauges could say whatever they wanted. He was landing those aircraft. At 10:28 hours, Sweeney's left engine coughed. The RPM dropped, recovered, dropped again. Fuel starvation. Morrison reached for the fuel selector, checking if any tanks still had fuel. They didn't. The engine coughed again and quit. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then Sweeney feathered it, rotating the blades edge-on to reduce drag. Left engine out, Morrison announced. Feathered. Continuing on, right engine. Sweeney adjusted rudder trim to compensate for asymmetric thrust. The C-47 yawed slightly, then steadied. Airspeed dropped to 115 miles per hour. Rate of descent, 75 feet per minute. Altitude, 5,800 feet. Distance to Henderson Field, 6 miles. Time remaining, 3 minutes. Behind him in the formation, 13 more engines quit in the next 90 seconds. 18 aircraft were now flying on single engines, all descending, all converging on Henderson Field. The remaining 12 aircraft still had both engines running but were showing fuel gauges reading 0. Their engines could quit at any moment. Sweeney keyed his microphone. Henderson Tower, this is Army Transport Flight Lead. We have 30 C-47 seconds inbound for emergency landing. Most aircraft are flying on single engines. Repeat, emergency fuel situation. Request immediate clearance for mass landing. There was a long pause. The British controller's voice came back, confused, uncertain. Transport flight? Say again, number of aircraft? 30C 47 seconds. We're all arriving in the next 5 minutes. All aircraft critically low on fuel. Some are flying on single engines. We need immediate clearance. 30 aircraft? Bloody hell. Stand by. Negative on standby. We're landing now. Sweeney didn't wait for clearance. He configured the aircraft for landing, lowered the gear, extended flaps, and began his descent. His right engine was still running, but the fuel gauge showed empty. The engine could quit at any second. If it quit before he reached the runway, he'd crash short of the field. Altitude, 2,000 feet. Distance to runway, 1 mile. Rate of descent, 500 feet per minute. Time to touchdown, approximately 2 minutes. He needed his engine to run for 2 more minutes. The engine kept running. Sweeney crossed the runway threshold at 100 feet, reduced power, flared, and touched down. He braked hard, turned off the runway, and stopped. His right engine quit 30 seconds after landing. The propeller slowed, stopped. The sudden silence was startling. Morrison sat motionless, staring at the instrument panel. They'd made it. Behind them, Lieutenant Patterson was on final approach. His C-47 was descending on single engine, barely maintaining flying speed. He crossed the threshold low, touched down hard, and skidded to a stop. His remaining engine quit as he cleared the runway. He'd landed with 0 fuel remaining. The third aircraft landed 45 seconds later, then the fourth, then the fifth. Aircraft were arriving every 30 to 40 seconds, all landing on a single runway, all with engines that could quit at any moment. The British ground controllers watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded in front of them. Lieutenant Chen's C-47 was 2 miles out when his right engine quit. He'd been flying on single engine for 12 minutes. Now both engines were dead. The aircraft became a glider, silently descending toward Henderson Field. Chen had altitude, 1,200 feet. He had airspeed, 95 miles per hour. He had distance, 2 miles. The glide ratio said he could make it. Behind him, 3 more aircraft landed with dead engines. All glided to landings. All made it to the runway. Ground controllers had stopped trying to coordinate. They simply watched as aircraft appeared from the south, descended in rapid succession, and somehow managed to land safely despite having no fuel. Aircraft number 28 landed at 10:39. Number 29 landed 30 seconds later. Number 30 landed at 10:40. All 50 C-47 seconds were on the ground. Not a single aircraft had crashed. Not a single crew member had been injured. Every aircraft had arrived at Henderson Field with empty fuel tanks, many with dead engines, and all had somehow made it to the runway. The British station commander walked out to where Sweeney was standing beside his aircraft. The commander was a wing commander, equivalent to an American lieutenant colonel. He was middle-aged, grey-haired, wearing an immaculate RAF uniform. He looked at the 30 C-47 seconds scattered around his airfield, at the crews climbing out of their cockpits, at the fuel trucks that were already being dispatched to refuel the aircraft. Captain Sweeney, I've been a Royal Air Force officer for 22 years. I've never seen anything like what just happened. How did you know you could make it? Sweeney shrugged. I didn't. But we had wounded soldiers who needed evacuation. Turning back wasn't an option. You landed 30 aircraft with 0 fuel. Most were on single engines. Several glided to landings with both engines dead. The mathematics say it shouldn't have been possible. The mathematics were wrong. The wing commander studied him for a moment. Your fuel gauges were reading pessimistically. You had more fuel than the gauges indicated, apparently. Or you made decisions that stretched your fuel beyond what should have been possible, reducing power, adjusting mixture, optimizing altitude and airspeed. We did what needed to be done. The wing commander nodded slowly. I'll be filing a report with RAF Command. What you accomplished today was extraordinary. Sweeney didn't respond. He wasn't interested in reports or recognition. He needed to refuel his aircraft, fly back to Myitkyina, and complete the evacuation mission. There were still hundreds of wounded soldiers waiting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. While the aircraft were being refueled, Sweeney met with the wing commander and explained the situation. The forward strip at Myitkyina was still under mortar fire. Wounded soldiers still needed evacuation. Henderson Field was the logical alternative, but only if they could establish a direct evacuation route from Myitkyina. The wing commander agreed to support the operation. Henderson Field had proper medical facilities, could handle mass casualties, and was far enough from the front lines to be safe from enemy fire. The evacuation would continue, but this time the wounded would come directly to Henderson Field instead of cycling through the forward strip. By 1300 hours, all 30 C-47 seconds were refueled and ready. Sweeney briefed his pilots. They would fly back to Myitkyina, land at the forward strip one at a time under covering fire from American artillery, load wounded as quickly as possible, and fly directly to Henderson Field. Each aircraft would make multiple trips until all wounded were evacuated. The operation continued through the afternoon. Aircraft landed at Myitkyina, loaded wounded under intermittent mortar fire, and flew to Henderson Field, where British medical personnel received the casualties and provided immediate treatment. By 1800 hours, 432 wounded soldiers had been evacuated. The mission was complete. The wing commander met him on the ramp. "Captain, your performance today was remarkable. Flying 30 aircraft to this field on empty fuel tanks, then completing the evacuation mission under fire. The RAF will be recommending you for recognition." Sweeney declined politely. "We were doing our job, sir. Nothing more. Your job doesn't include landing aircraft with zero fuel. Your job doesn't include gliding transports to dead-stick landings. What you did today went far beyond any job description. The soldiers needed evacuation. We evacuated them." The wing commander smiled. "Very well. But know that what happened here today will be studied by transport pilots for years to come. You demonstrated something important. When the mission is critical and the stakes are high, extraordinary things become possible." Sweeney flew back to Dinjan that evening. He filed his mission report, noting that all aircraft had returned safely despite critical fuel situations. He didn't elaborate on the details. The report was routine, clinical, stating facts without drama. Aircraft launched, mission completed, aircraft recovered. Sweeney never corrected these stories. He rarely discussed the mission. When asked about it, he'd say they'd had a fuel problem, made an emergency landing, and completed the mission. Nothing extraordinary, just another transport flight in the CBI theatre. But Sweeney had understood something that the mathematics didn't account for. Fuel gauges weren't perfectly accurate. They provided estimates, not certainties. An aircraft showing 5 minutes of fuel remaining might actually have 7 or 8 minutes, or it might have 3. The only way to know was to keep flying until the engines quit or you landed safely. He'd also understood that turning back wasn't an option. Wounded soldiers were dying. Every hour delayed meant more deaths. The mission had to be completed. If that meant taking risks with fuel margins, so be it. Transport pilots in the CBI theatre took risks every day. Flying the hump meant accepting that you might not make it back. Flying into forward combat zones meant accepting that you might get shot down. Flying with marginal fuel meant accepting that your engines might quit before you reached your destination. The key was managing those risks intelligently. Sweeney had reduced power to minimum cruise, optimizing fuel consumption. He'd climbed to altitude where engines burned less fuel. He'd planned a straight-in approach with no holding or pattern work. He'd coordinated with the other pilots to ensure everyone understood the plan. These weren't heroic actions. They were professional pilot skills, applied under pressure. Captain Charles Sweeney continued flying transport missions in the CBI theatre through the end of the war. He flew the hump another 237 times, evacuated thousands of wounded soldiers, delivered critical supplies to Chinese forces, and never lost an aircraft. His efficiency reports noted his exceptional judgment, his ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, and his unwavering focus on mission completion. When aviation historians discovered his wartime service record in the 1980s and asked him about the Henderson Field landing, Sweeney was characteristically modest. He said fuel gauges had been inaccurate, they'd had more fuel than indicated, and the landing had been routine. He declined interviews, avoided publicity, and refused to attend veterans' reunions where he might be celebrated. Morrison said, "Charlie saved 50 aircraft and 432 wounded soldiers that day. He did it by refusing to accept that the mathematics said it was impossible. He knew what needed to be done, and he did it." That's the definition of leadership under pressure. This doesn't mean the Army Air Forces encouraged reckless fuel management. It means they recognized that rigid adherence to fuel minimums could prevent mission completion in circumstances where those missions were critical. The updated doctrine gave pilots discretion to make fuel decisions based on circumstances, experience, and judgment. Captain Charles Sweeney died on March 14, 2008, in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was 92 years old. His obituary mentioned his 32-year career with Northeast Airlines and his service in World War II. It noted that he'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions in Burma, but provided no details. The obituary was 3 paragraphs long, modest, and understated, exactly as Sweeney would have wanted. His funeral was attended by family, former airline colleagues, and 3 surviving CBI theater veterans who'd flown transport missions during the war. None of them had flown with Sweeney on the Henderson Field mission, but all knew the story. It was legend among CBI pilots. The mission where 50 aircraft landed on empty tanks and everyone walked away. Sweeney had demonstrated an alternative. When the mission was critical, when lives hung in the balance, impossible became negotiable. You didn't accept the mathematics if the mathematics said you couldn't save people who needed saving. You found a way. You made adjustments. You took calculated risks. You completed the mission. That mindset, the veteran said, had saved thousands of lives during the war. Pilots facing fuel emergencies remembered Sweeney and kept flying instead of bailing out. Pilots transporting wounded remembered Sweeney and landed at forward strips despite dangerous conditions. Pilots flying the hump remembered Sweeney and continued through weather that should have forced them to turn back. The Henderson Field landing wasn't about one captain flying one aircraft. It was about demonstrating that limits were often more flexible than people believed. That fuel gauges reading 0 didn't always mean 0. That aircraft could fly further than their specifications suggested. That determined pilots could accomplish missions that appeared impossible. Charles Sweeney is buried at Worcester County Memorial Park in Paxton, Massachusetts. His headstone is simple granite, listing his name, his dates, and his military service. No mention of the Henderson Field landing, no mention of the Distinguished Flying Cross, just the basic facts of a life spent in service. The lesson from his mission endures. When lives depend on completion, when the mission is critical, when conventional wisdom says turn back, sometimes the right answer is to keep flying. Trust your training, trust your aircraft, manage your resources intelligently, and above all, never accept that saving lives is impossible just because the fuel gauge says you can't make it. The standard procedure in 1944 was to land with a minimum of 45 minutes fuel remaining. This reserve provided safety margin for weather diversions, holding patterns, or navigation errors. Pilots who consistently landed with less than 45 minutes fuel faced discipline for poor flight planning. The reserve wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Sweeney had violated this standard on July 23 by continuing to Henderson Field when his fuel gauges showed he wouldn't arrive with any reserve remaining. He'd calculated that he might arrive with 0 fuel, possibly running out before landing. The mathematics supported this calculation. His fuel gauges showed 8 minutes remaining when Henderson Field was 9 minutes away. Pilots learned not to trust fuel gauges completely. Experienced aviators developed intuition about their aircraft's fuel consumption based on engine sound, performance characteristics, and flight time. Sweeney had been flying C-47 seconds for 14 months in the CBI theater. He knew his aircraft intimately. He understood that his fuel gauges tended to read conservatively, showing less fuel than actually remained. This knowledge informed his decision to continue to Henderson Field. He wasn't gambling blindly. He was making an informed calculation based on experience. His gauges showed 8 minutes fuel remaining. His experience suggested he likely had 10 to 12 minutes actually available. Henderson Field was 9 minutes away. The margin was thin but survivable. The other 29 pilots in the formation made similar calculations. Those with more experience trusted their instincts and continued. Those with less experience watched the experienced pilots and followed their lead. The result was that 30 aircraft arrived at Henderson Field with fuel tanks that showed empty but contained enough residual fuel to complete landing. Aviation safety investigators who reviewed the mission in subsequent years noted that Sweeney's decisions appeared reckless on paper but were actually calculated risk management. He'd identified the mission requirement, assessed available resources, calculated margins, and made decisions that accepted thin margins in exchange for mission completion. This wasn't courage. It was professional judgment, applied under pressure. The success of the mission depended on all crew members executing their roles competently under stress. Sweeney received recognition because he was the aircraft commander and made the final decisions, but he consistently credited his crew for the mission's success. In the few interviews he gave late in life, Sweeney emphasized that transport operations were team efforts requiring coordination among pilots, crew chiefs, medical personnel, and ground support. The cooperation between British and American forces at Henderson Field exemplified the alliance that ultimately won the war. National pride and bureaucratic procedures could have complicated the situation. The British could have insisted on proper advance coordination. They could have demanded formal requests through command channels. Instead, they saw wounded soldiers arriving and provided immediate assistance. Wing Commander Harrison, the Henderson Field Station commander, wrote in his after-action report that the American transport crews had demonstrated exceptional airmanship and courage. He recommended that the RAF study the mission to identify lessons for British transport operations. His report emphasized that fuel planning should account for gauge inaccuracies and that experienced pilots should have discretion to make fuel decisions based on mission requirements. The evacuation meant these soldiers received definitive medical care within hours instead of days. Soldiers who would have died from infection or blood loss survived because they reached hospitals quickly. The mission saved an estimated 60 to 80 lives based on medical assessments of injury, severity, and time to treatment. One of the evacuated soldiers was Private First Class William Chen from San Francisco. He'd been shot through the chest by a Japanese sniper on July 20th. The bullet had punctured his lung and fractured 2 ribs. Combat medics had stabilized him at the forward aid station, but he needed surgery that wasn't available at the front. He'd been waiting for evacuation for 3 days, developing pneumonia from the lung injury. Chen was loaded onto Sweeney's aircraft during the first evacuation run from Myitkyina to Henderson Field. He was unconscious, running a high fever, in critical condition. British surgeons at Henderson Field operated on him within 90 minutes of arrival. They drained the infected fluid from his chest cavity, repaired the damaged lung tissue, and administered antibiotics. Chen survived. He was evacuated to a hospital in India, recovered, and returned to duty in October 1944. Chen attended Sweeney's funeral in 2008. He was 84 years old, a retired postal worker, living in Oakland, California. He told Sweeney's family that their father had saved his life and the lives of dozens of other soldiers. He said that Sweeney had never sought recognition or thanks. He'd simply done what needed to be done, and that was the mark of true character. The Henderson Field mission represented a specific type of aviation challenge that transport pilots in the CBI theatre faced regularly. The theatre lacked the infrastructure available in Europe. There were no networks of well-maintained airfields with navigation aids and ample fuel supplies. Instead, pilots operated from primitive strips carved out of jungle, navigated by dead reckoning, and managed fuel reserves carefully, because diversions weren't always possible. These conditions forced pilots to develop skills that weren't emphasized in training. Fuel management became an art form. Pilots learned to calculate consumption based on engine sound and performance. They learned to identify when gauges were reading accurately versus conservatively. They learned to make decisions about continuing versus diverting based on incomplete information and time pressure. The terrain added another layer of danger. The route from India to China crossed the Himalayas, mountain ranges with peaks exceeding 20,000 feet. The C-47's service ceiling was 26,000 feet, but loaded transports struggled to maintain 15,000 feet. Pilots flew through mountain passes, threading between peaks, hoping weather wouldn't force them into terrain. Weather in the CBI theatre was brutal. Monsoon season brought heavy rain, low visibility, severe turbulence, and icing conditions. Aircraft encountered weather that should have grounded them but couldn't because the mission was critical. Pilots flew through conditions that violated every safety regulation, not from recklessness but from necessity. The casualty rate among transport pilots in the CBI theatre reflected these dangers. The Troop Carrier Command lost approximately 600 aircraft during the war, with over 3,000 crew members killed or missing. The loss rate per sortie was lower than bomber losses in Europe, but the cumulative toll was significant. Transport crews flew hundreds of missions, and the probability of eventually encountering fatal circumstances was high. Sweeney's survival through 237 hump crossings represented both skill and luck. He'd faced weather that killed other crews. He'd dealt with fuel emergencies, mechanical failures, and Japanese fighter encounters. He'd made decisions that could have ended in disaster but didn't. Some of that was professional competence. Some was experience and judgment. Some was simply chance. Sweeney exemplified these traits. His decision to continue to Henderson Field appeared to violate fuel regulations, but he'd calculated the risk, assessed his options, and determined that continuing was less dangerous than alternatives. His judgment proved correct. All 30 aircraft landed safely. The mission succeeded. No one died. The alternative scenario illuminates why Sweeney's decision was rational, despite appearing risky. If the 30 aircraft had turned back from Myitkyina, instead of continuing to Henderson Field, they would have flown back toward India. Most would have run out of fuel over jungle before reaching Indian airfields. Aircraft would have crashed in terrain where rescue was impossible. Crews and wounded soldiers would have died. This decision-making framework applied throughout the war in all theatres. Commanders and individual operators constantly assessed risks and chose courses of action that minimized danger while maximizing mission success probability. Some decisions worked, some didn't. Sweeney's decision worked, and 432 wounded soldiers survived because of it. The evacuation of wounded soldiers represented one of the humanitarian aspects of military operations that received less attention than combat actions, but was equally important. Soldiers who knew they would receive medical care if wounded fought with greater confidence than soldiers who believed wounds meant death. The presence of efficient medical evacuation systems maintained morale and combat effectiveness. Studies conducted after the war showed that wounded soldiers in the CBI theatre who reached medical facilities within 12 hours of injury had survival rates exceeding 90%. Soldiers whose evacuation was delayed beyond 24 hours had survival rates below 70%. Time to treatment was the critical factor determining outcomes. Sweeney's mission on July 23 reduced time to treatment for 432 soldiers. Instead of waiting additional days for the forward strip to reopen, these soldiers reached hospitals within hours. The mission's medical impact was significant even though it wasn't a combat operation. The Army Air Forces recognized the importance of medical evacuation and assigned experienced pilots to these missions. Transport pilots who flew medical evacuation learned to accept risks they might not accept for cargo missions. A delayed cargo delivery was inconvenient. A delayed medical evacuation meant soldiers died. The mission priority affected decision-making. This mindset wasn't unique to Sweeney. Every transport pilot who flew medical evacuation developed similar attitudes. The missions weren't about fuel management or flight planning. They were about saving lives. Pilots made decisions accordingly. The families of soldiers evacuated on July 23 never knew how close their sons and husbands came to dying in jungle crashes. The soldiers who survived went home after the war and resumed their lives. Most never learned about the fuel situation during their evacuation flights. They knew they'd been wounded, evacuated, and treated. The details of the flight didn't matter to them, but those details mattered to aviation historians studying the war. The Henderson Field landing represented problem-solving under pressure, professional judgment applied in crisis, and successful mission completion despite circumstances that should have prevented success. These themes recurred throughout the war in all theatres and all service branches. Military history traditionally focused on combat operations, major battles, and strategic decisions by senior commanders. Recent scholarship has examined the operational level of war. studying how logistics, maintenance, medical support, and other enabling functions made combat operations possible. Sweeney's mission exemplified this operational level. Similarly, fuel management by transport pilots wasn't a minor technical detail. It was a critical skill determining whether missions succeeded or failed. Sweeney's ability to stretch fuel consumption, calculate margins accurately, and make informed decisions about acceptable risk directly affected mission outcomes. The war was won through accumulation of thousands of missions like Sweeney's, individual operations that shouldn't have succeeded but did because competent professionals applied their skills under pressure. These missions didn't make headlines. They weren't celebrated with parades. But collectively they determined the war's outcome. Captain Charles Sweeney understood this. He never claimed his mission was heroic or extraordinary. He insisted it was routine transport work performed under difficult conditions. From his perspective, every mission in the CBI theatre involved difficult conditions. July 23rd was simply another day of solving problems and completing missions. Modern military aviation has incorporated lessons from missions like Henderson Field. Fuel planning now includes explicit procedures for managing uncertainty in fuel gauges. Pilots are trained to calculate fuel consumption based on actual engine performance rather than relying solely on gauge readings. Emergency procedures emphasize that gauge indications are estimates requiring interpretation. These lessons apply beyond military aviation. Commercial airline pilots face fuel decisions on every flight. Weather diversions, traffic delays, and mechanical issues can create situations where fuel becomes critical. Modern aircraft have sophisticated fuel monitoring systems, but uncertainty still exists. Pilots must interpret data, make decisions, and sometimes accept thin margins to complete missions safely. The principles Sweeney applied in 1944 remain relevant. Know your aircraft's actual performance, not just published specifications. Understand that instruments provide estimates requiring interpretation. Calculate risks carefully, but don't let fear of risk prevent necessary action. Trust your training and experience when making decisions under pressure. Aviation safety has improved dramatically since World War II through better technology, improved training, and systematic analysis of accidents. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Pilots must make decisions based on incomplete information under time pressure, with significant consequences. The quality of those decisions determines outcomes. The mission succeeded because everyone involved performed competently under pressure. Sweeney provided leadership, but he couldn't have succeeded without professional crews, cooperative British allies, and reliable aircraft. Military operations require teams, not individuals. Success comes from coordinated effort by people who understand their roles and execute them effectively. This understanding informed Sweeney's consistent deflection of individual recognition. He knew the mission had succeeded through collective effort. Praising him alone misrepresented reality. The crews who flew the other 29 aircraft made identical decisions and accepted identical risks. The British controllers who cleared the runway and supported the landing enabled success. The medical personnel who treated wounded soldiers completed the mission. Sweeney's name became associated with the Henderson Field landing because he was flight leader and made the initial decision to divert there, but he would have been the first to emphasize that leadership means coordinating others' efforts, not individual heroics. Individual medals couldn't capture the complexity of military operations. They simplified reality into narratives about heroes and decisive moments. Sweeney understood that reality was messier. Success came from competence, coordination, and cumulative effort by thousands of people doing difficult jobs under impossible conditions. His refusal to wear the medal or discuss the mission wasn't modesty. It was accuracy. He hadn't won the war. He'd flown one transport mission that happened to work out. Millions of other people had performed their own missions, some successful, some not. Collectively, these missions determined the war's outcome. No individual contribution was decisive. This perspective characterized the World War II generation. They'd witnessed the war's scale and understood how individual actions fit into the larger context. They'd seen too many competent people die from bad luck, and too many incompetent people survive from good luck, to believe that outcomes reflected individual merit. Sweeney had made good decisions on July 23rd, But he'd also been lucky. His fuel gauges had read conservatively, giving him more fuel than indicated. The weather had been adequate for visual flight. Henderson Field had been available and able to receive 30 aircraft without notice. Any of these factors could have been different, and the mission would have failed despite identical decisions. Aviation operations involve managing controllable factors while accepting that uncontrollable factors will influence outcomes. Pilots control aircraft configuration, power settings, and flight path. They don't control weather, fuel gauge accuracy, or mechanical reliability. Success requires managing the controllable factors expertly, while hoping the uncontrollable factors cooperate. The mission succeeded. Sweeney received recognition, but he understood that similar missions flown by equally competent pilots had failed due to unfavorable luck. Those pilots deserved equal recognition, but received casualty notifications instead. The difference between success and failure often came down to factors beyond anyone's control. This understanding created perspective. Sweeney hadn't accomplished something impossible. He'd accomplished something difficult that happened to work out. Other pilots had attempted equally difficult missions and died trying. He'd succeeded and survived. That made him lucky more than exceptional. Military historians who analyze World War II increasingly recognize the role of contingency and chance in determining outcomes. Popular narratives emphasize decisive battles and brilliant commanders. Academic research reveals that outcomes often hinged on factors no one controlled or even understood at the time. The Henderson Field landing exemplifies this reality. Sweeney made good decisions, but success also required his fuel gauges to read conservatively, his engines to perform reliably, Henderson Field to have available runway space, and British personnel to cooperate with an unexpected mass landing. Any single factor going differently would have changed the outcome. Recognizing the role of chance doesn't diminish Sweeney's accomplishment, it contextualizes it. He performed excellently within the parameters he controlled, while benefiting from favorable circumstances regarding factors beyond his control. That's how most successes occur in complex environments. Sweeney flew 237 hump missions successfully. That wasn't luck. That was skill, judgment, and professional competence applied consistently over 18 months. The Henderson Field landing was one mission among hundreds where his competence enabled success, but it was the mission that became famous because circumstances were dramatic. Fuel gauges reading empty, engines quitting in flight, multiple aircraft gliding to landings. The story had elements that made it memorable and repeatable. Sweeney's other missions were equally important but less dramatic, flying cargo to Chinese forces, delivering ammunition to forward bases, evacuating wounded soldiers under routine circumstances. These missions enabled Allied operations in Burma and China. They contributed to eventual victory. But they didn't generate stories that spread through the theater. This disparity between important work and recognized work characterized military service. The missions that mattered most often weren't the missions people remembered. But Sweeney understood that recognition was irrelevant. What mattered was accomplishing the mission and supporting the people depending on you. He'd done that on July 23rd and on 236 other occasions. Some missions were dramatic. Most weren't. All were necessary. That was military service. Doing necessary work regardless of whether anyone noticed or cared. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.